Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
Hello. On today's episode, we have a conversation with smut writer and exhibitionist Jem Cutt, all about the anarchy behind the queer deconstruction of eroticism and sexuality. Together, we talk about reckoning with queer bodies, the personality type of an exhibitionist, and expanding our understanding of sex. This is such a fun episode. If you want to learn more about queer culture, about cruising, about the hanky code, and so much knowledge about queer history and culture, this is the episode for you. I love all of the resources and wisdom that Jem brought onto the space. It was such a pleasure just to hear all of the ways that they are embodying their full expression of authenticity. Y'all are really going to enjoy this episode. I hope you tune in. Do you have any questions about the podcast specifically that I can answer?
Not particularly. I guess I was kind of interested, or I was talking with a couple of friends about it. I think, and I feel like I kind of said this in an email, but kind of curious about where, or like how you define anarchy in the podcast.
Ooh, yes.
You know?
Yeah. I define it as anyone who's defying their culture's status quo, right? Mm-hmm. Which could mean a lot of different things, I think. Like,
totally.
I know I've talked with people who have defied Mormon culture, and, like within that culture, there's specific things that I would call anarchy, right? To like defy that and build your own path. So I think whatever that is to the person. Mm-hmm. And I also love to just be like, I take up a lot of space. I just want to see what other people define it as. That's why I ask other people to nominate, because then like in theory, I'm also not defining it. Each person defines it. So like Z defined it nominating you, and you'll define it by who you nominate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, it's fun. Anything else? Yeah. Was that the main one? Yeah.
That's the main one. And I'm curious what you have to ask me.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, tell me.
So then tell me, I know you mentioned you have multiple jobs.
I do.
Do you want to tell me what they are?
Sure, yeah, I would love to. So the easy one that I tell people who are, not familiar with the smut writing that I do, or like porn that I make, is I'm like, I work in a warehouse. Okay. Manual labor. I used to do office jobs and couldn't do it. And so for the past 5 or so years, I've pretty much always had a manual labor job, which I really like, actually, because it's a way to have my mind to myself a little bit. So I work in a wood shop. I work using, sometimes a forklift or like packing boxes or that kind of thing. And really and basically the entire time, whenever it's safe to do so, I have these headphones on, and I'm listening to like audiobooks or podcasts or voice notes that I leave for myself that I will use for first drafts of writing projects or ideas for projects with friends. And so I like being able to have my mind to myself.
Yes, that makes a ton of sense.
Which is really cool. So I do that. And that's the not super glamorous one. And then, none of them are very glamorous, but
sure.
I do some figure modeling sometimes for art students. Another situation where I get to have my mind to myself and embody myself kind of differently. And I think it's important, that was one. And I think these are kind of inroads into the context that Z knows me into. I'm interested in I don't know, as a queer person, as a trans non-binary person, thinking about how my body is, kind of reckoned with in a public and private way. And so figure modeling was really important for me as a kind of step there of being and I think this is true in porn work too, but that traditionally, we think about the power structure as the person, whoever's drawing you, or whoever's like viewing you or filming you, or in these different contexts, like has a lot of power, and that's true, and that can definitely be abused. But for me personally, and also I'm an exhibitionist, so I'm sure it's part of that, like, not to sexualize that job, but like as a personality, for
yes,
sure.
Yes.
But but it really does feel like when I'm working like that, and sometimes in a more sexual context too, but like even in a non-sexual way, with a more traditional like art context, it feels like I'm really like asking whoever's rendering me in whatever format to like, to like reckon with me and try to like figure out how to present me, which is like interesting to me, even as someone who like, is often read as cis, and like I have a lot of like, I'm like a pretty thin white person, like there's like a lot of things that are like really legible, I think, but even small things like the way that I hold myself is like not the way that, and again, background in figure modeling was like not the way that the like feminine poses are held or whatever.
Right.
And like body hair and that kind of stuff is like really small. And
the cat, it's the time. Hi, fat cat. You're saying
anyway,
the hair.
Hair and like how you hold yourself and all of these things, like again, kind of like least of all for me, or like I noticed this with me, and then of course it's like for people whose like bodies are even further outside of like what people are expecting to see or like familiar with or like comfortable with or whatever. Anyway, so it's like more of a reckoning, but
I'm curious with the word reckoning. What do you feel like that word is referring to?
I really feel like it's again, this mostly came out of the figure modeling work where, and I think that's the most like, I don't know, where you can like take this idea, or where I take it and run with it, is because it is really literal. It's like I would be watching someone look at me and like struggle to get the image down, and like struggle.
In their face?
Wow. And I'd see students be kind of frustrated or being like, erasing things and getting it wrong.
Wow.
And trying again, or like, making drawings, and then teachers going around and being like, does this model actually look like that? Or walking around and being like, oh wow, that doesn't look like me at all, and like, so that was really interesting. And I think that I think that was like a more concrete version for me that I think of like as a queer person out in the world. Again, even with all of the privileges that I hold and like how I move through the world, there is also a like a way that I feel when I'm walking through a like really cis space or a really like straight space, and being like, instead of feeling like, oh, all these people are looking at me, or like picking me apart, or like they know what they're seeing, feeling this more, honestly, more confrontational approach, and being like, actually, you have to like you have to look at me, like you have to look close. And I think that it takes a lot of like power back, which is interesting to me. I feel like this is a conversation that I have with a lot of friends in the like kink world or whatever, when we talk about, right, we can talk about like what is like dominance and what is submission, and like what kind of acts are like traditionally seen as submissive or dominant. And I think, again, truly not to sexualize that job, but like the exhibitionism as not just a like, oh, a thing that turns you on necessarily, but also as a way of like being in the world. And like, again, a thing that like I talk about this with potential play partners and things about like, like what should be humiliating, like, oh, exhibitionism or like being exposed or something like is supposed to be something that is like really disempowering. But I think for a lot of people, and I know for myself, it can feel actually like, really powerful to be like, now people have to look at you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it's a reversing of the power dynamic, going from that, the artist that's struggling with it, to instead being like, no, you look at me and deal with this amazing person in front of you. You know what I mean? Like that is a huge power flip to take that back. And so, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. So that is, that's been really important for me.
Hell yeah.
And I think like informs how I move through spaces even outside of that. Again, just like a menial job that I had, because I was like, oh, I need something again where I can have my brain to myself. And then I was like, oh, actually, this is changing how I am thinking about things.
Oh yeah, because the problems of society are everywhere, showing up in these little experiences like this that add up over time
Hmm.
and how we see
Yeah,
ourselves. Yeah, 100%.
definitely. And I think what's interesting to me too is like I feel really lucky that the I live in Philadelphia, and the
Yeah,
like neighborhood that I live in, the friends who I have, like almost everyone is trans, which is amazing and great.
right.
And it also leads to some like situations that I think are interesting, or like thinking about what kinds of work people take. Also in terms of bodies, is like most of the figure models I know, how I got into it is like a couple friends who are trans were like, oh, I had this job, it pays okay if you want. And a couple of them have been working in these same for these same schools, like
Sure.
while after they had top surgery, like while they started HRT, like.
Mm,
And anyway, and this is like not necessarily super related to everything I
it's
do, but I
all
think,
important. It's all important.
yeah, well, I think again it's that like thinking of the reckoning, right? Like thinking of like
Hmm.
people having to like, hi Nina, having to like change what they, or yeah, having to like reckon with you, and like, yeah, work with something that
Yeah.
they're not familiar with.
Right, exactly. Something that's, define their understanding of the world, which is causing them discomfort that they need to get over.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, which is, and it's also asking a lot of the in that situation, which again I think we
Yeah.
can like expand from, is asking a lot of the model too, because of course it can be
Yeah.
like the way that people look can be really violent and like really
Right.
intense. But if there are even those small moments of being able to reframe that discomfort in a place of like, oh, I'm making you uncomfortable actually,
Yeah.
instead of like you are being really hostile to me. I don't know. Yeah.
It seems like the difference almost between like victim using like this is happening to me versus I am causing this to you. Like
Totally.
that
And
it is a power switch there.
yeah, and I think it's something that, that is not going to be applicable to every situation, of
Of
course. And
course,
like
right.
also it's real that like, yeah, that you like can be a victim in that situation. But if you're able to make that shift,
So
I think it can
yeah, it's a
feel
reframe, a different positive, like it's a more positive way to look at that situation, which is obviously horrible, right?
hmm.
But in the reality of the horribleness, like what is within our control is our ability to see the situation and make meaning of it. So yeah, I think that's an important thing and an important perspective. I'm curious
Totally.
too, because you talked a little bit about being an exhibitionist and not in
Hmm.
a sexual way and it being a personality type. I'd be really curious to hear more about what that means for you.
Yeah, totally. So I think it's something I can turn on. Like I can be a shy person, which is kind of hilarious to some of my friends because I can be also very like really not shy.
Sure, sure, sure.
But I think it's related to that conversation of being like, I often feel like my most powerful, or like in my body and in myself and like sure of myself, if I'm like, I don't know, exposed in some way, which doesn't
For
have to be,
sure.
which I like, would love to talk about in the context of like sex and kink, and like because I write smut and like do some
Yeah.
porn, and like that's really
Yeah.
important to me. But I think it can also apply to like, before I was writing smut, I was writing a lot of poetry and like doing a lot of poetry readings. And like one of the places where I felt the most powerful was like on stage performing, and I'm
Yeah.
like, it's the same thing. Like
Mm.
it's just exposing yourself. And I think that can also go for like, I don't know, approaching the world with a kind of openness of like sharing yourself. I think that is a kind of exhibitionist tendency.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
I,
And I also think like, oh, sorry, no,
no,
please.
I was like, I like where this is going. We're getting all of the qualities. Like, if you have this quality, you might be an exhibitionist. And I'm like, yes. And inside, I'm like, check, check,
I love
check.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I also think like now I'm going to take it into a place where just what I've been thinking about a lot recently is
Yeah.
like, well, okay, so not necessarily like visibility, although it's related, but like
Okay.
contact.
Mm-hmm.
So I am a nerd for Samuel Delaney, as a lot of queers are.
Who is this?
Oh, excellent. This is great. This is my favorite game.
Okay. Am I ready?
Like
What are the rules? What are the
pulling,
rules?
just watch Jem pull books off the shelf, but I won't.
I'm
I
ready.
will
I'm
not run
ready.
into the other room. So Samuel Delany is he lives in Philly, but he's a gay writer who wrote a lot of science fiction and a lot of like really radical stuff.
Yeah.
He's a Black science fiction writer
Mm-hmm.
and has been publishing really prolifically since like, oh, I'm gonna get all the dates wrong, but
It's fine.
70s, 80s.
Long time.
And so he's really famous for that. And he's also really famous for his, or whatever is like important for a lot of people, for his writing on public sex and gay life and queerness.
Ooh.
And so he has this book called Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, that's essentially about the importance of like queer cruising, specifically for gay men, in New York prior to all of like porn theaters getting shut down in Times Square.
Yeah.
And so he has a few, yeah, sorry.
Could you explain cruising to someone who might not know what that term means?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I would love. So that's bringing us back to the idea of like looking. Cruising is, I mean, I guess in its most basic form, it's just like looking for sex, essentially. And so historically, it's especially with queers, but I suppose it could be for anyone, is a way of like signaling to other people that you are seeking or interested. And so making contact, maybe having sex, maybe having some kind of like encounter. And so this looks like, well, it looks a lot of different ways, but one way that I think people recognize is like the hanky code for,
you should probably explain that as well. Yeah,
totally. I would love to. So the hanky code is something that, again, huge hat tip to gay men. It's a whole code where you'd have different colored hankies that mean different things. And you can also signal what you're looking for based on which pocket you wear your hanky in. So your right side is receptive and your left side is giving. And so, for instance, if you were wearing a black hanky means heavy S&M. And so that could be like a lot of impact. That could be like some degradation stuff or like intense pain. It can mean a lot of different things. And so if you're wearing it on your right side, that means that you want to receive these things, all of these sensations or dynamics, or like bottoming, which again is more like receptive. And if you wear it on your left side, then you're saying that you are maybe a more dominant person who wants to do these things to another person. Or like, so that's black. And then, you know, red is fisting. And so it's like, if you have it on your right side, you want to get fisted. If you have it on your left side, you want to fist someone. And then there's this kind of whole elaborate code that goes for a bunch of different colors and positions. And so I think the queers are bringing it back. I'm pumped about it. But again, historically and contemporarily, it's a way to signal to people that you're like seeking sex and seeking contact. And you know, there's other ways too. I think people think about cruising as like, you know, it's kind of a joke almost for in like queer social circles, with being like, you know, making gay eye contact, of being like, you see that person and like, are you? Think so, you know, like making eyes across the cafe or the bar or the park. And then I think that, you know, there's again all this like really actually sophisticated way of communicating without saying anything at first, like nonverbal communication. And then the like initial conversations can be careful and then super direct. And like there's constant negotiation of like consent and interest and like respecting boundaries and everything. But it is this like, again, cruising generally just a way for like looking for sex in public.
For sure. Yeah.
In a way that's not, which I am personally interested in. I was thinking of things to talk about. Well, I think that it's like, you know, out of the closets and into the streets, not into the apps, is how I feel.
Okay. Oh, well, say more. I'm very curious. Because apps are horrible.
They are. They're terrible. And I think that like one reason that they're terrible is that they're really like atomizing. I think that they really isolate us. And again, it doesn't have to be like, what is sex? Who knows? If you want to have someone beat you up in a consensual way, is that sex? Who knows? Contact. And so pleasure, exactly. And it makes totally, and it makes this kind of like sexual life really, really private and like individual in a way that it wasn't always that way, especially for queers. And so it's taking it away from this like more public sphere of like the joy of like sharing eye contact in a public place, right? Or like where you're with friends maybe, or like you don't necessarily know this person, or they're seeing how you move through the world, rather than like you are just the sum of whatever you put in a profile, you know?
No, I agree.
And this is and one thing that I think is also really important is that, and this is partially why I bring up Samuel Delany in terms of looking also, again, because if you're cruising, then you're looking, and that can mean, you know, you could be listening too, but you're like interacting with people, is that, so Delany has this theory in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, where he's talking about essentially like the importance of cruising spaces having to do with like a larger social good, which doesn't have to be, it can just be for pleasure, but is that like cruising areas like porn theaters or like parks that were traditionally cruising grounds or whatever are places where people have like close contact with people who they wouldn't necessarily run into normally.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that like sex was a way for, in his case, like gay men to like socialize, make bonds, have experiences across, or something like community, even if it's just, even if it's just about pleasure, but like, and you don't know each other's names, like it's a cross-class, cross-racial, like, and like, and it's a place that I think if those kind of like interactions, if like, honestly, if sex is like just kind of cordoned off into like an online space, then people are much less likely to like just encounter people and like and see whatever chemistry's there, have whatever kind of interaction, and are much more likely to, you know, have all their filters on for like what kind of age group they want to see, like in some of the apps, like what kind of body type you want to see, you know, or like if people are listing their education, like maybe you're a person who went to college who only wants to sleep with people who went to college, which is kind of, maybe you should interrogate that, but like there's anyway. And so in a public space, like those things fall away and you get to interact with people and see people for like outside of all of these like markers that otherwise you can use to filter people out. So I think those are really, really important spaces.
I'm really thinking about that idea of being able to meet people out in public and feel an energy, feel a persona, feel a person out without knowing the specifics of age, education level, whether they smoke, if they have kids, you know, the whole thing. It's just, it is very interesting to be in a time where now people's mating friend choices, even now since Bumble Friends now, even stuff like that too.
Oh man,
people are making decisions based on like already knowing your like kind of resume to a degree, which is just very
which really totally, and it really plays along class lines in a way that is like
100%.
That's like really upsetting, I think, and like concerning. And I think that again, like it doesn't have to be this way, but like sex like can be a way to break that down. And I think that there are like my vision of the world like would like public sex could be more of a thing. There's a project from some folks in Minneapolis that is actually there's two like quotes that I have in my head. I had kind of a terrible memory, so
it's okay, you're good, I'm with you.
Have them. Okay, thank you. One of them, I don't remember the exact quote, but I do recommend looking up, is from Dean Spade, who I think a lot of people are familiar with. He's a trans writer and theorist and academic, and he writes about a lot of things. He was famous, or like was more well-read this past couple of years because he has a really great zine on, again, he's like an academic who writes academic papers, also has a like zine culture background, and has a zine on mutual aid that was making the rounds. It's really great. Highly recommend. And he has another one, but it's on polyamory, which I thought you might be interested in. The zine is called For Lovers and Fighters, Relationship Anarchy.
That's what I'm studying for my dissertation. I need to speak to this person.
Really must. Truly, truly great. So and he like is an anarchist and is writing about relationship anarchy. Again, like has a lot of like political stuff. You should really get in touch. Anyway, and so in it, he's talking about, you know, and I think a lot of like relationship anarchy is thinking about like not ranking people, right? Not being like, oh, this is my primary partner and this is my secondary partner and this is my like comet, which is one person I see only once or something. There's a lot of polyamory terms that are out there, which is great. You know, people should have them if they work for them. That's great. And I think like his approach and like a lot of like anarchists' approach to relationships would be something that like really does break that down, where like there aren't necessarily any like preconceived notions or like rules for how you're going to interact with someone. And that can mean looking like, you know, having a romantic and sexual relationship with someone and being open to having romantic and sexual relationships as they happen in your life. In addition, it can also mean like, you know, prioritizing non-sexual relationships and like friendships in the same way, or however feels natural to that relationship rather than like automatically being secondary. So those things are true. And I think people cite that zine often for those reasons. But what's beautiful to me about particularly how Dean Spade lays out relationship anarchy is that it does ripple out. And so he's talking about like, it's this really beautiful part. I really wish I had in front of me. But he's saying that like on the train, he'll try to, or like in public spaces, he'll try to look at people and imagine what that person looks like to someone who loves them.
I try to do that.
Yeah. And that it becomes a practice. And so like you look at people who you really don't like, you know, you might even really have like a lot of animosity towards someone, and like still it being important to try to imagine what that person looks like to someone who really loves them. And that is something that just is humanizing and like makes you softer to the world in a way that's really important. And so I think I'm thinking of that idea, and then I'm also thinking of, I don't want to just keep making a whole bibliography, but there's this
I'm down. I'm learning so much right now, so please feed me. I mean, this is important information. I've never heard of this person. So. This is great. Keep going. I'm taking notes.
Amazing. I'm so glad. I'm like, this is also like, oh, we're gonna have a conversation. These are just the things that I talk about. So here we go.
This is great. This is great.
So one person who is a friend I know personally, Zach Ozma, made a with this other person, Alice Martin, in I don't remember a few years ago, published The Selected Diaries of Lou Sullivan. So he's considered the first, this is not true, of course, because people have existed forever, but in terms of like historical records in the US and like medical records specifically, he's considered the first out gay trans man. And so, he died of AIDS in the 90s and left behind a whole lifetime of meticulous diaries. Really wonderful, really special. And like one reason that they're important is because, again, these are just like real footnotes, but important footnotes until Lou Sullivan got treated, but well into the 90s, 80s and 90s, it was impossible. You would be refused care if you were, I mean, not that this doesn't still happen, but trans people, if they were gay, if they weren't like, oh, I'm a trans man who's interested in women, if you were a trans man who was interested in men, or if you were a trans woman who was interested in women, you would be refused care because of homophobia and transphobia, a good combo. And so I think, again, and also there's this like image of like, for instance, with trans masc people, like being like, oh, this person like used to be, and of course, like, obviously this is not accurate, but like used to be a butch lesbian, and now we're making like a straight man, you know, is the idea behind that logic for care, which is really fucked up. And so in order to receive care, a lot of trans men who were gay would, like, they couldn't say that. And Lou Sullivan was a white man from like middle class background, had a lot of things going for him already, or like stacked in his favor. And he like refused to deny that he was gay and like interested in men. Anyway, and so his diaries are really important because I think until media representation has really changed in the last few years, and it's easy, at least in the circles that I run in, it's easy to take for granted that like, oh, of course all the trans boys are gay, like, you know, like that actually, but like so many, but like that literally it was thought that this was like didn't exist, like was impossible, or like, or just some really twisted transphobic thinking of like why would you, if you're interested in men, then like why don't you just like not get like the care that you need so that you can like stay straight, even though obviously you're not straight, so that you'll have just like
faulty logic,
just like nope. Anyway, so his diaries are really important, and one of the quotes that he has in there, and he's talking about a bunch of different things. He's talking about his own like body and person, and also his relationships with other trans men, and like romantic relationships generally, friendships. But he has this quote that says, "There's no limit to the kinds of relationships that we can." This one I do have on my fridge.
Yes, get it.
Thank you. because some of my queer anarchist friends put it on a flyer for a rave, so that was great. There are no rules for the kinds of relationships we have and want to have, which I think is really great. And I think like that, coupled with Dean Spade thinking about like looking at people trying to imagine what they look like to someone who loves them, both of those things, I'm like, yeah, like those are like political arguments, and they're also like arguments for, to me, a world that allows space for desire to be like paramount, right? To like love, openness, affection to other people, right? And then also, and like openness to be surprised by people, to be like, I don't know about you actually, which I think now with like, I don't know, with social media and a lot of other things, like there's like, I think there's a lot of possibilities that are foreclosed. And so I think that the idea that there are no rules and limits to the relationships you can have to someone and the relationships that you're allowed to want with someone is like, yeah, pretty cool. And
it's expansive.
It is. And so I think like, sometimes I like to do this lead up with all these like, you know, whatever theorists or people who are like are writing about politics also as a way to say, and therefore we should have public sex. So
anarchy to everything.
I mean, it's not just about that. The project tell me.
It would have to be in like enclosed spaces for
totally,
you know, like
but like
kids
consent
and like
for
stuff.
Kids, exactly, totally. But it's very tricky. And I think the thing is, or I'm like, and again, it doesn't have to be like literally. I think, well, no, I don't want to take the literal away from it, because I was about to say, like, you know, when I talk about public sex, when like Delaney or Jose Esteban Munoz is also another queer theorist that a lot of people love. He has a book called Cruising Utopia that is also really important for a lot of queer people, and it's thinking about, well, a lot of different things, but like cruising queer embodiment as like, you know, I think we talk about it in like really academic ways, right, in terms of like performance studies or whatever. And I think he was one of the, and I know, you know, this is all just reading I did on my own.
I'm listening.
But he's one of the theorists who like took that like close study of like movement, right? Or like how you occupy space, and applied it to things like cruising, like walking down, like how a queer person walks down the street and makes eye contact with someone, how someone like flirts with someone else at a bar. Anyway, so all to say that public sex can be a way of like moving through the world and not literally fucking on the street. And I don't want to betray my ancestors and be like, no, Delaney meant literally. Delaney did mean in a porn theater, like in a space, but like did mean that.
Sure. Say more. Public sex in a way. Not okay. Yeah, say more. I'm just gonna let you continue.
No. I mean, I'm sure I could really just keep going on about this forever. But
what do you mean by it? Yeah, what do you mean by public sex then?
Totally. So I think I mean two things. I mean literally spaces that are not private, that have the possibility for sex, for fucking,
so like a play space, like a kink play space.
Sure. Or like, you know, it used to be, again, I know that it's complicated. I personally don't think it's a bad thing. But like public restrooms used to be a cruising place for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to be like, oh, like, you know, like bars or like establishments. And I think that's true. Like that can happen. And it would be cool if spaces like that existed for people to also like explore their sexuality or whatever. And a lot of those spaces are actually private. It costs money to get in. And like not everyone has money. And you have to like know someone who knows someone, which makes it safer for sure. And it also like we're getting into that territory of like only interacting with people who you might already interact with, right? And so I think that it's cool that like people might, again, like cruise each other in a public park, and then like maybe go to a house, or maybe go, if they don't have a house, find an alley or something, or like a covered place. But so I do mean it literally. I would love for people to actually be able to have sex. And I do think it's also that, again, like broader thing of being like, what is sex? Sex is also like making eye contact, you know, and being like, and being flirty and being open to possibility, and like knowing that kind of like connection could happen. It's mostly that. It's mostly the being open to possibility.
Yeah.
Again, this is a thing that I think a lot of started as kind of a joke, but is deeply not a joke. I started to mention this before, but there's some folks in Minneapolis who are just doing excellent work.
Mhm.
I don't know if they're totally anonymous, but it started that way. They put out a zine that again just like made the rounds in some like queer and like I first saw it at like anarchist zine fairs, I think, but
Sure.
they called Make the Golf Course a Public Sex Forest.
Wow.
And it's a manifesto
Yeah.
to turn one of the golf courses in Minneapolis into a sex forest.
Wow.
And it was like I think about to be sold or like I don't know. There was some impetus where it was up in the air what was going to happen, and they were
Yeah.
like, "What if instead of turning this into a private, expensive place where people can go play and like use a lot of pesticides, what if this?" And like, do one of, in my personal opinion, the most boring sport. What if instead it was this like pleasure garden where people could like,
Sure.
you know, walk in and there were like consent practices everywhere and like it was understood. And if anything bad happened, people would escort them out. And it's
Yeah.
this like lush,
Controlled.
beautiful
Yeah.
garden, totally, but also uncontrolled. And like
Right.
there's gardens everywhere that like you can, you know, snack on while you're like meeting a lover, but also you could like take the food home and it's a free garden and like just like all these possibilities.
Yeah.
And again, I mostly started as like extremely cheeky, but people loved the zine and then started applying it to their own cities and like, yeah. And like, again, like it is joking, but it is, I think it's a way that, again, I personally would love it if every golf course had that function. I would love it. It'd be great. And again, like there are so many, there are so many questions around like safety, right? Or like children, all these things. And I think that like actually these spaces coming from a place of like, again, public, being able to be like, oh, we can like self-regulate, like maybe actually you don't need to have, I mean, I am going into some dangerous territory, but like, I think these ideas, even in just like a thought experiment way, are coming from a perspective of being like, actually people can like look out for themselves or decide, or there's like more agency than, I don't know, than deciding something that's like really private or like has a bunch of rules attached to it.
Sure.
So I think there's
a little bit more freedom.
that. Yeah. And so I think, so there's that idea that again, mostly a joke, also not a joke, and is making people think differently about public space, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that again, it's that kind of like, and about a public being like, what does it mean to like meet people, meet strangers, do these really intimate things in the public sphere and not have it just be a private thing. I think that's, and not shameful. Like there's so many things built into it that, or like aspects that I think are, again, are like really easy to joke about or really easy to be like, you know, for myself. So I'm a nerd, obviously, and I like read about these things and I have these other jobs and I also like write smut and like start like do a little porn stuff or like a little bit of porn stuff and like do like am part of some kink communities and like, so it's easy for me to be over on this part of myself and be like, haha, like I'm a, you know, a flirt and like I love this slutty future for the queers, da 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 da. But the thing is, I'm like, oh, and I also mean it. Like it's also not frivolous. Like I think it's great that it's like joyful and like, yes, prioritize pleasure and like do all these things and it doesn't have to be that deep and then be like, and actually like some of these ideas that we have around public pleasure, around possibility, around like connection outside of predetermined relationships or like I don't know, social stratification, like those are actually really important and are like bigger than just, you know, all these, again, my world is specifically a lot of queer and trans people, but like, you know, all these queer and trans people just having like whatever kind of bacchanalia, it just is bigger. So that's
for sure. I mean, I think it's super fun to dream. I know there's like a lot of specifics of like, how would this actually work out and be like a safe idea and like make sure that everything was consensual and worked out and all those sorts of things. But it is fun to dream of like because dungeons and kink play spaces are still very like hidden. It's not
Mhm.
like you just kind of like know, even if you're trying to get into those, you still have to do a little bit of digging to find out where can you do that in your city. So like even
Totally.
if that sort of thing was brought out just a little bit bigger to have a space where it was, like, hey, this is the intention with this space is freedom, pleasure, whatever that looks like for you as adults that can consent to this sort of space. And I
Definitely.
think it's a big point. I mean, it's an interesting concept. I mean, sex is 100%, well, not 100%, but well, it's always a dichotomy, right? Here I go now. Sex is private, like the actual practice of it typically is so private, right? Where what we think of as sex is so private. Yet it's in our face in advertising and all that sort of stuff, but like typically the
Totally.
actual engagement in sex is a considered supposed to be private act. So it is an interesting thought. I mean, I think taking it into a public space requires us to challenge things like monogamy, typically those sorts of dynamics, a lot of
Mhm.
heterosexual tendencies. Like, I mean, you're flipping dynamics here when you're now watching other people interact in
Mhm.
sex, and then like when you have a response you know what I mean, like that's turning up society and every single point. So it's fun to dream of a world where we would have that sort of freedom and society would kind of have this better relationship, maybe I would say a more mature relationship to sex and pleasure.
Definitely. Definitely. And I think what's also
Yeah.
interesting is like even as you're saying that, and I definitely agree, I'm like, oh, and what's cool is like people have been doing this and it's been private. Like I think again,
Mm-hmm.
this is, and there are so many things that are really murky and
Yeah, that's
not
specifics.
not great
Yeah.
about some of the like cruising culture of yore,
Mm-hmm.
or like bar culture or whatever. But I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, and as someone who is like not a cis man and like has I feel close to a dyke identity is how I usually identify myself. Like there weren't as many spaces like this for the dykes, but for gay
Yeah.
men, like there again, public sex like sex wasn't always private actually, really, and like they're almost to the point of harmful stereotypes, but yeah, that these kind of
Yeah.
relationships, like people really have been doing this, and I think that it's or even things like I personally am excited about of like yes, it challenges monogamy for sure, and like
Mm-hmm.
also again like what kind of and people should can have whatever kind of relationship they want to any sexual intimacy, but again it like challenges what sex is like,
Yes, 100%.
like
Yep.
and what intimacy is like.
Yep.
Sometimes kissing is a whole lot more intimate than like someone using a glory hole. Like it's just
Sure.
depends, and in a way that I think is really cool, like for sure challenging heterosexuality and even challenging like strict identity roles within like sexual subcultures. I guess it feels like a
Mm.
really dated term, but
Sure, sure.
because I think like also these kind of more collective spaces are a space where if we're talking about historically in play spaces or more like larger established play spaces or like sometimes bar culture, gay men and queer women like would have sex together or play together, right? And I'm like,
Mm.
oh, and that's something that we don't even talk about. Like it's not
Mm. Yeah, talk about it.
anyway. Yeah, it's exciting. Well, I think it's
Yeah.
like it's a thing that happened. It's a thing that does happen, and I think that like I don't think term community feels so empty a lot of the time. But
Mm.
I think that like this kind of connection across identity lines and like sexuality lines or whatever
Yeah.
is really important because again, it's just like blurring categories and like separations, and
Mhm.
it's like foregrounding pleasure more so than it feels like collaborative or something. It's about the
Mm.
space, it's like maybe you aren't primarily, if we're talking about like a traditionally, like probably historically, like cis gay man space, and like some, and there like are queer women there and like they are having sex together, like doing something together.
Sure.
It's more about like what they're feeling in that moment and not necessarily like, oh, are you the kind of person I'm attracted to? Oh, I probably wouldn't have sex or like play with you. If you're talking about kink spaces, like I probably wouldn't play with you outside of this space. But in
Mm.
this space, I want to. And it feels
Yeah.
good. And we can give each other pleasure, even if we
Yeah.
aren't explicitly attracted to each other, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Mhm. It's about the energy more than the like
to-
physical or whatever attraction.
Totally. Yeah, which I think is really cool and brings us right back to the like collective versus like private in terms of like dating app stuff, of like
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
connections with
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
based on like just curiosity and connection. But
Sure. And I'm sure the exhibitionist piece of your own identity comes out through all
absolutely.
of this, right? Like all of the publicness, all of this, like
Mhm,
it's permeates it. Because for you, that is
definitely.
where you feel all energy coming to you.
It's true. It's true. It's so
Yeah.
funny. I really like, I was thinking about this recently because who knows what's going to happen with COVID. But the first few like play parties that friends I know or like some people I know are starting to kind of happen,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah.
And I remember, and I basically feel this every time I'm in a play space, but I'll kind of go in and like I am a person with a lot of social anxiety. Like
Yeah.
I definitely am an extrovert. I do get energy from being around people and I
Sure.
love to meet people, but I get really anxious. And I'm like, yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm
Same.
really not sure. And I'm like, oh God. And then there's always whatever embodiment stuff or being like, am I, it's like if you're feeling already anxious, at least for me personally, the like dysphoria can come in with this angry head and be like,
Sure.
oh, who
Sure.
am I? I don't know. Or like, oh, this
Sure.
feels wrong. And I can walk
Yeah.
in feeling like, oh God, I might have a real bad time. I am not sure. I'm overwhelmed. And while people are like kind of chatting or like when I'm doing like a one-on-one thing, I'll feel kind of nervous. And then as soon as people start playing, I'm like, oh, I feel great. Like I feel like myself, I feel totally comfortable if
Mm-hmm.
I am like, yeah, being able to like, if I can be more of my exhibition self, like
Yeah.
it feels almost easier if I'm like, oh, people are watching me or people
Sure.
can watch
Sure.
me rather
Sure.
than like walking in and being like, oh God, are people looking at me? And it's
Sure.
that moment
Yeah.
of reframing maybe, but, and maybe it's just my natural
Intention.
tendency. Yeah.
The
Of
different
being like,
intention.
totally,
Yeah, interesting.
totally.
Tell
Mhm.
me more of what that looks like. If your like ideal moment of like I felt the most empowered in this moment, like could you paint that picture for me?
Oh my gosh, sure. Yeah. I don't know. Like, how much can I say on
You
this,
could
on this
say
podcast?
anything. There are no
Yeah.
rules. Like there's no
Amazing.
rules here. Go full deep.
Okay, great. That's great.
Yeah,
Well,
visualize.
the thing that I'm thinking of, I guess this would be like the fantasy that is a combination of things, of like experiences for me. But
Mhm.
I feel like walking in and being able to, look around, make eye contact with people, they're like comfortable. There's a lot of activity going on. We're like meeting, maybe I am a sucker for in a play space or like a smaller gathering, to
Mhm.
have some kind of like opening circle of introducing yourself or like saying maybe what you're like looking to get into that night, not with a whole in-depth processing. That's not for me personally, but for like intention setting, being like, I might be interested in, one person's like, I'm really looking for a lot of impact tonight. And someone
Yeah.
else is like, I'm really feeling like kind of docile and like a really sweet puppy. And someone else is like, I'm really playful or whatever. And you can start to do some kind of
Mhm.
matchmaking or seeing what's going on.
Yeah.
So I like thinking about that. And then
Mhm.
being able to like float. I like to move around a lot. And so like being able to float between different roles. I like thinking about giving people sensation,
Mm.
and having people watch
Mhm.
me. That feels really
Yeah.
great and like really beautiful. And being able to tell whoever I'm playing with that like, people are watching you and they feel so
Mm.
lucky to see you. So
Ooh.
that feels really good. And then honestly, like again, as someone who like doesn't always feel great being really vulnerable and open, like I am naturally vulnerable and open,
Yeah,
but at
yeah,
least in
yeah.
play spaces, I'm like, oh, I like, don't bottom for everyone or whatever. When I imagine the ideal of some kind of, yeah, bottoming, which is like, being
Yeah,
more
yeah,
receptive, is the scene that I had is just like people watching me and maybe like a couple people holding me, like maybe one person behind
mm,
me, and like maybe one person kind of like holding my legs in a way that's like kind
mm,
of restraining, but not actually, it's more like supportive. And then for any of the smut that I make, I am a bit of a fisting evangelist. I think it's great. I
yeah.
think everyone should try
Tell
it.
me. Yeah, tell me.
No matter your anatomy, but
Mm,
yeah, and thinking about like someone fisting me or like maybe a couple different people, and it's this like collaborative effort of like
yeah.
witnessing how much my body can take and like feeling like people are watching me and really appreciating this. And that's the space where I feel like I can have more of a like, and this isn't even that necessarily playful. This is more of a heavy thing, but like really like release and like,
Oh, yeah.
I've had situations where like in that setting I'm able to like, really cry or like, and also in
Wow.
a way that's like really loving, like feeling really held in the room and feeling like
Yeah.
this is a space where like everyone here, or like who wants to watch this or participate, can like hold all of this big feeling, and like I don't have to hold it by myself, you know? And like that's a moment, exhibitionism and voyeurism like lets me have that space for like asking people who are watching me to help me like hold things.
So vulnerable.
Definitely. Yeah. And that vulnerability, like being able to be, again, it's similar to the reckoning or whatever, but being like, I'm doing this, like, and now you like, you know, hopefully want to witness this or like you definitely do want to because you're choosing it, but also like that feels really powerful to be like, I am able to make myself this vulnerable. And
it is
like,
powerful.
Yeah. And so, so I feel like that's one of my ideals, is this kind of like collective experience that has to do with, I guess, witnessing, you know?
Sure. And I'm sure being in these spaces must have changed your understanding of relationships, including your relationship to yourself, I could imagine.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I'm not I'm not some expert at all. But for my own experience, yeah, definitely being in play spaces that is also a kind of public sex, even though again it's like in a private space, whatever.
Sure.
But that's how we talk about it, right? And that like, and sometimes it's easy to forget to be like, oh right, like the first time that I walked into a play party, I was like I was like wide-eyed, like really couldn't. I was like, oh, this is so exciting, like this is amazing. And also it is like, and it wasn't like, again, the queers are out here, it's not everyone's like super buttoned up exactly, but like seeing everyone intentionally, be like having sex next to their friend who they're roommates with or whatever. And it's kind of like collaborative and like sweet. You can have a really intense, like emotional, heavy experience like the one I just was explaining. And then you can also be like, fooling around with your friends or like figuring out different skills, or like doesn't always have to be like whatever you think sex, like intercourse, whatever it looks like it can be, you're seeing people like have sex in ways that you're not used to, or you're seeing people touch people in ways that you're not used to. And I think for me, that was really important with thinking about different options for what I can do, different ways that I can be. Yeah, really thinking, I just am so grateful for the many different parts of like queer experience that are really important to me. Because I think even outside of that, there is more conversation around like the different kinds of sex you can have, but being in those spaces too, for sure, of being like, oh, like, you could be having a really intense experience that it doesn't involve anyone's genitals. You could have a really intense experience that's like, or like interesting experience.
Right. And all of these sort of things I think are anarchy, right? When the quote unquote definition from society of sex is penis vagina, right? Like, and
wild,
like, so anything beyond that I consider like we are trying to challenge the norm here when we are having conversations about this, about like, what is sex? How can we expand that lens, and where can you learn about that? For this is the play space, right? But if that's so private, then how are other people learning about different ways to show up in relationships, different way to have relationships and to enjoy relationships? We don't really get to see that when it's so private. So I think it makes sense.
Definitely. And I have a friend who I look up to a lot, and she'll often say something about about a lot of different things, but one way that's exciting to me and relevant to this conversation is she'll talk about sex this way sometimes and be like, it could just be a lot more interesting than it is, like not only like, oh, like more pleasure or like more, even more affirming or something. Like it's not even necessarily in those terms. It's like, oh, it can be interesting. You can be like doing something that's making you like think in a way that's exciting to you, or like is just kind of curious.
Say more.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about like,
tell me.
I don't know, some of the there's times when I feel like I'll joke with this with like friends or lovers or like play partners or whatever, and be like, can you believe that some people like, or like, what would someone who thinks that like, penis vagina is the only kind of sexy, or like that is what sex is, like, what would they think if they saw this happening, like whatever we're doing? And I'm like, I don't know. But I have one friend who, and I don't know what this like turned into, but like, one thing that was super erotic for her was that like, a lover was, they're both nerds, they read a lot of books or whatever, but like she likes a lot of pressure. And I forget, it was some kind of power dynamic of like, she had to sit there through it or something. But yeah, her like lover was piling books, like heavy, she's an academic, and she was had all these books, and she was piling them on top of my friend, who was just getting like laid down and like just like pressure all over her body.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know what happened after that. I'm sure that there's like also other things that were going on, but like that was the main activity. And that was the like sexy thing. Like that was really intense, you know? And it's like, maybe, I literally don't remember what happened. I like, you know, I was like, maybe there was some like sexual touch like through tights or something, but like, it wasn't, yeah, like that was the thing that was super erotic. Or like, you know, I like have had friends, again, like jokingly, but also not jokingly, being like, wow, like someone's belly button is so erotic to me. Like, wow, do you think I could like fuck someone's belly button with my like T dick, like a like dick that's like bigger with testosterone or whatever, for someone who's trans? And it's like, again, kind of a joke and kind of not. Being like, you know, or like, this is something that I feel like is, again, almost a like inter-community like joke, but is also real, where like it feels very dykey to me, but it's very queers generally, of being like, oh, my hands are my favorite sexual organ by far, like absolutely, you know. And like like they're so exciting, and I feel like I could just like, you know, I have a friend who likes one of the friends I've mentioned, who are like, one thing that she's amazing at is like taking out someone's whole fist in her mouth, and I'm like, wow, you are incredible. Like, how are you doing that? The feeling of like having fingers down in someone's body in whatever hole, but like also one of the most erotic things of like having my like hand in someone's mouth is amazing to me, like so hot. And I'm like, again, in a really like whatever like cishet perspective, I'm like, that isn't sex at all. That's like not even foreplay. That's just like
yeah, no, for sure. Yes.
And I forget it. I'm like, wait, what?
Yes. That's why the show exists, because I think we need to bring these conversations to people who've never heard this. To people
Definitely.
like, wait, what? Like, it can be way more expansive than this, and we're like, yes, it can be, because sex, in my opinion, you know, what is sex? I've had that conversation before, and it's so hard to define, but it's like it's adult consensual play, right? So like it's playing with your bodies and sensations and having fun between two consenting individuals. Go at it. You know what I mean? Like, there's way more pleasure than just penis and vagina.
Yeah. And like being curious about your partner, about yourself. Like, again, things that I think are so hot and just are. And I think this is especially true. I feel this in a big way with like any kind of like, I don't know, like gender non-conforming people with each other or whatever, like a T for T, but doesn't, you don't have to identify as trans or whatever, but like is just this like fundamental curiosity of being like, nothing is taken for granted. I don't know how you like to be touched.
Exactly.
Like, even if your anatomy looks a certain way, I don't know what you like.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. And like, I want to say, you know, great consent practices, but I'm like, damn, this should really be baseline. But like, you know, ask what someone wants. And also you get to like witness. So like one thing that I think, if we're talking about like, you need to think about, or like what is hot differently maybe, or like different options. Is I'm like, one of the hottest things to me is like mutual masturbation, right? Is like getting yourself off next to or in front of someone with each other, like witnessing someone touch themselves. And I'm like, that is, again, I guess something that people wouldn't consider as sad. It's wild.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I'm like, it's so hot. Like, you're letting me witness how you touch yourself. Like, that is amazing. It makes me so hot. I don't feel like left out or whatever. I feel like this is just like really beautiful. And I don't know. And that's like, I feel like it's just, if you're not allowing for that, there's just so much more, interesting kind of dynamics you can have with people. Pleasurable for sure, but like playful, like just not having anything be a given.
Yeah. And I think this is part of like the expansiveness that you were expressing earlier, and I'm feeling a lot with you. And I think part of the queer deconstruction lens is frequently that, like, if we deconstruct these supposed ideals, we find out that there's a ton of space out there.
Totally.
And I feel it.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that's something that I really want, like I try to do so I like write smut stories and make some porn. And in all the writing I do, especially, I'm like, well, in everything, but I'm really trying to leave room for that, right? Of like of expansiveness, of being like, maybe there is no like climax, or like maybe these are two people who you wouldn't expect. I only write queer characters, but I'm like, you know, maybe this is like self-identified like trans fag and like a cis dyke or something, or like maybe this is, I don't know, or like some like high femme for high femme situation or something. But like I like to have play with gender, because again, that's what's hot to me also, is like, and it's fun and interesting, and these are the people who I'm hanging out with and want to write for. And to like I want to be like writing these fantasies and like speaking these fantasies into the world, because again, it's mostly what I want to see, but I'm like, oh, other people should hear this too, you know. Or like and even things like, you know, one of the writers who made me want to write queer smut is Zan West, who passed, unfortunately, pretty young. And he was a trans man who wrote a lot of smut with trans characters, lots of T for T, which is amazing. He has a lot of characters who are disabled and fat. It's really, really great. And a lot of his books are out of print, unfortunately. But I remember when I read his work, he was one of the first writers who I read who was like, you know, had trans people, and like, well, yeah, most of his characters are trans, but like talking about like, you know, literally anything can be a cock, anything can be a clit, like anything can be like whatever kind of hole you want, you know. And like there's no rules for how you need to interact with people. There's also no rules for language. Like you can just use whatever. And I think it's cool, again, even in my own work, being able to be like, oh, I'm just going to use this word for this person's anatomy, and like you're going to roll with it, and you're going to figure it out, and maybe you're not going to actually super know like what it looks like exactly, but you actually don't need to know. And you can like imagine this. And I think that there are like, one thing, I should have made a list of people to shout out, but like there are like really cool writing and like queer porn out there that I think is like, again, we talk about it in terms of like just, I mean, I think and I hope that people are watching it to get a lot of pleasure, maybe to get off, to get turned on, etc. And I'm like, to imagine new worlds. Like I think that like
it's art,
like I think it really can be. And and I think that that's like amazing. One of my favorite, one that I will shout out is that Aorta Films is really amazing. They're like they're a queer porn company. They make really amazing work. They're great. Right. Z. I was just going to say, Z does work with them. Z does work with them. So many people I love and admire have done work with them. Again, like I actually don't think I can think of a scene that doesn't have someone who's trans in it, which is amazing to me. They make really gorgeous queer porn that's like hot and beautiful. And I think they have some they have some really exciting projects coming down the line too that are also like looking at supporting like other content creators too, or like, you know, independent creators, which is really cool.
Awesome.
But so they're great. And then another project called Four Chambers is also some like arty porn, which I love personally and I'm a sucker for. And I'm like, and in no way to like look down on other, because there's also like really amazing people making work that's not necessarily arty or whatever, high production value. And I think that that's like equally as important, but these are ones that are like feel easy to shout out right now because it's all in one place. But there's this one film that they have that's so hot, and it's called Archetype, with, I forget the other person's name, but one of the performers is Devora, I think. It's a T for T, like trans mask for trans mask scene. They're kind of wrestling, they're working with like archetypes of porn, and in it they both, I think it's a T shot, I don't think it's gel, but it's, they like give each other a shot of testosterone in it, and it's so erotic, it's so hot, and like and it's also this moment that's like, it's like a really beautiful shot, you know, and like we're talking about penetration, like that's also penetration. It's amazing. And to be able to see that as like, again, something that like whatever in like cis hetero world is like so deeply not sexy, and make it be like, not only is this like an option for you, we're going to celebrate how fucking hot trans people are, we're also going to like say that this like act can be super intimate and like erotic. Like that is amazing. That's so good.
It's creative, and it's such a power, exactly what you were talking about throughout. I feel like this whole conversation, like that framing of power of like, I'm gonna take this to celebrate and be sexy. This is my space to take up and decide the meaning of.
Hell yeah. Totally I think it's really, really cool.
Yeah. I want to hold some space too as we close. I always like to check in and make sure that there wasn't anything before coming into today that you were like, I really wanted to talk about this that maybe we didn't hit to during our time.
Totally. I know. I'm really trying to think of it now and I can't.
That's okay. I always check. It's totally fine if there's not.
Not specifically.
Cool.
Let's see.
I do have a closing question as well, so like I can go to that as
great.
well. Okay.
That's great.
So then one question I ask everyone on the podcast is what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal? Take it anywhere, your brain. I know you're creative and very intelligent from our conversation, so take it and fly.
More normal.
Which I know is normal.
No. That's great though. I feel like, because I feel like the question is really like, what's something that like, it's not just you who's experiencing
exactly.
this.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that feels very basic, but does feel like important to me right now, at least also, is I'm like, yeah, this feels like a really pat answer, but I think it does apply to a lot of people, which is like, I think it's more normal to like play with some gender shit than you think it is. And I think that can go in a bunch of different directions where I'm like for cis people, especially for cis straight people, I'm like, I just wish for you, for your own sake, that like I just really think you deserve, to be able to, I'm like, I just bet that there's some stuff that you want to play with or like are interested in. And it's just like not weird. It's in fact great.
Yes.
Much more interesting than to not be curious about those things. So I really hope for that. And there's more I could say on that. And then for queer people too, I think this also applies, and this is speaking from my own experience of like coming into queerness being like really, coming from like the lesbians, bless them, and I love them, but like into more of a dyke identity too, which is a little, feels different, but
I'm sure it is.
And being like, being afraid of being like, oh, if I want to play with different gender things, like, does that mean that I'm like, playing into something? And I'm just like, that, don't stress about it. Like, do not stress about it.
Yeah.
You're fine. And like, yes, maybe it does mean that like, maybe in any of this, like, maybe it does mean that you are like exploring your gender. Maybe you're not cis. Like, that's really important. I wish that more people would explore that. And I'm like, it actually doesn't even have to be about that. It can be about roles. Like maybe, again, daily in your life, I wish people would explore these things. And if we're specifically talking about like in a sexual context, like, like if you want to be, if you're like a really masculine person who like kind of wants to be a little girl or like use like feminine language or like do things that are like more considered feminine, like you get to do that. And it doesn't have to be, it can be something that's like trickling over into every part of your life, but it doesn't have to be. You could be like, you can like play with lots of different roles. And it doesn't, I guess that's more of it, is being like, you can play with a lot of different roles and it doesn't have to be, it like doesn't have to be scary or bad or like some like deep, I don't know, Freudian truth about yourself. Like, sure, you just get to play. And like, I think that's so important. And I think so many people, don't feel like they have the space to do that. And there's 100%. A bunch of reasons for that. But I wish for more people to be able to.
Right. And I feel like, I hope society is getting to a point where we understand the baseline that gender is a social construct. I hope we're getting there closer. And I feel like once we can accept that, then it's pretty much like, okay, well then all the pre-assumed notions of what it means to be a gender and all those various things, like there is no hold or chain on us anymore with these things. You can live freely and play with things. There's more space.
Exactly. And it just means, I think that there's a lot of, again, specifically if we're talking in a like sexual context, I think that there's a lot of kind of experimentation and like interesting, and like, again, we were talking about different ways of having sex, and I again feel really blessed that like the world I'm coming from, that is not an anomaly and is not considered strange. And I imagine that if you're coming from a different world, having a kind of sex that doesn't involve your genitals or like involves one part of your body more than another or something, or like you don't use your body at all or like whatever, like I imagine that could have it could feel like it has like really big implications for like, who are you? What does this mean about, I don't know, yourself as a person, as a sexual partner, as a,
Totally.
like, as your gender, like, or
Totally.
whatever. And yeah. And I think that like, that's too bad.
For sure. And I feel like that's, at least personally with me, that's something that I've seen in my own practice as I've taken on different sexual encounters, right? So I'm sure that is true because when I take on new roles and it's always like, well, who am I with this new role? And it's, you have to incorporate it in some way. And I think exactly what you're saying is like kind of along that path as you start to realize that you have more expansiveness also in your capabilities as your personality. I don't know if that's the right way to say that. Like you can try on different roles, play out different characters and like enjoy that and still have a complete whole sense of self. You have different relationships that take on different roles, different dynamics. And we see that in some smaller scales with other things, like when we see parenting versus like jobs versus friends, and people bring out different pieces of themselves, right? But I think we just need to continue to expand what those different roles are that we can take. And I think you've talked about that in such a brilliant way. I just want to thank you for all of the knowledge that you had, all of the resources, like left, right. This is
oh my God.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. Yeah. And I also like, just to say that, you know, my response to that question is also totally coming from my own, like, you know, struggles with that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like setting my own limitations. Absolutely. You know, and like, like foreclosing certain like dynamics or like experimentation or whatever because of a whole lot of insecurities. And and I think again, like as much as possible leaning into that, just being like curiosity and expansiveness and like not being like so worried about things being so like fixed in place that like if anything shifts them, then like you will shatter into pieces and you just won't. So I think, or if you do, maybe it's towards something that's a little more fluid and then you won't next time.
Yep. That's where I've been getting, just keep more and more fluid.
Amazing.
It feels nice to have that little space instead of trying to put yourself into a box all the time. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. It's hard not to. It's a world that really wants to do that for people.
Yes. I feel that. Well, this has been such a pleasure. I really enjoyed getting to just like walk with you through all the thoughts of your mind. It was so much fun. I mean, this is my sort of conversation, anarchy, queer deconstruction, and what is sex. This is great. Is there anywhere you want to plug for people who want to connect with you and find out more about your work?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Right now you can find me on social media. So my name is Gem Cut, or that's the name that I use for smut stuff. And my socials are Gem Smut. So it's close, but different. And my Instagram is at gem.smut. So Instagram is where I have more writing. Twitter is a little more naked on the internet.
Nice. Love it. So Exhibition is coming out.
Honestly. So you can find me there. And you can see my fantasies, but that's at gem_smut. Yeah. And one thing that I would like to plug right now, there's some projects in the works that will be coming down the line, but one thing that has been a long time coming and related to what we talked about today is I really love the Queer Archive, you know, generally, and I won't get into it because that I could also talk about forever, but one thing that's present in a lot of queer archives, because stuff often got destroyed, you know, is matchbooks left over from queer bars. And matchbooks are great. I love ephemera generally, and like they're also a cruising device. So people used to, and I hope they still will, like write their number on the inside of matchbooks and then give them to people. But anyway, I've been making these matchbooks.
Wow, look at that. That's so cute.
Yeah, so they say Dyke Dreams on them, and they have my name on the back with an email address and the city that I'm in as a like stand-in for a gay bar and a way to get in touch, and a number on the top that people can call to leave a fantasy, and maybe I'll write a story. And in each of the matchbooks, in each of the matchbooks, there's a little story, a smut story that's like folded up on vellum paper that's like sort of like similar to rolling papers.
Very fun. Yeah.
Thank you. But there's like, I think right now there's 7 different stories. They're tucked inside. Cool. And these are things I've been making for a minute, and I've been leaving them. Really, I was just like giving them to friends and like bringing them to play parties. I brought them to, you know, New York Pride and then gave them out to strangers and like left them at, you know, some collective living places in the gay woods in Tennessee, and like they've been scattering with friends. But now I am finally distributing them more intentionally, and I'm selling them for right now. It might shift because I think they met their fundraising goal, but yeah, I'm selling them sliding scale. Like I think it's $2 to $6 right now. And all the funds go to benefit Serenity House, which is a project in Philly. It's a drop-in center for street-based sex workers and like women and trans and queer people who are involved at the like intersection of like, or who live at the intersection of houselessness, street-based sex work and like drug use, and like people who use drugs. And it's like drop-in center that is all like run by a community, and it's really cool and like a really great resource and really necessary resource. So they're just kicking things off. They have a new space that they're trying to support. So all the money goes there, and then if they meet their fundraising goals, it'll go to other orgs to support sex workers. So
hell yeah, amazing. That's a great way to give back. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, I don't know, people want the matchbooks, like we'll see. They don't cost almost nothing to make, and like I'd love to support, and people have been interested. So that is, if anyone wants a matchbook.
Hell yeah, happy to support.
And like, you know, keep in touch, would love to connect with anyone interested in doing projects and talking about queer smut always.
Hell yeah. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much. I really want to appreciate you. I really appreciate you for the time that you've spent on the podcast with me today.
Totally. Thank you so much. And thanks for doing this project.
Of course.
So glad that it's out there.
Yeah, it's very fun. I get to talk to you. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're a part of the Anarchist community, then follow us on Instagram or nominate a guest for the show by sending in a letter to modernanarchypodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.